My name is Diana Marsh. I'm 39 years old, and I want to tell you about the afternoon my mother called me crying from a parking lot outside a Western Union where she had just wired $47,000 to a man she believed was a federal agent. The man was not a federal agent. The money was gone, and the only person who could help her was the daughter she had spent 12 years telling she had made a mistake. But I need to start where this story actually begins, which is not in a parking lot or on a phone call. It begins in a kitchen in Charlotte, North Carolina, when I was 24 years old and told my mother I had been accepted to law school at UNC Chapel Hill. My mother Margaret had spent her career as a dental hygienist, 31 years of it in the same practice, building the specific kind of professional identity that comes from doing honest work. She was not a woman without intelligence. She was sharp and observant and had the particular practical wisdom of someone who has spent 3 decades watching people and understanding them without the benefit of formal credentials. She was also a woman who evaluated professional choices through a specific and narrow framework. Does it produce a stable income? Is the pathway clear? And will the outcome be visible to the people around her? Law school in her framework did not produce the right answers to those questions. Not because she thought I was unintelligent. She thought I was very intelligent. But she had a specific picture of what lawyers were, the courtroom lawyers of television, the criminal defense attorneys, the personal injury practices she had seen advertised on billboards, and the kind of law I was interested in did not fit that picture. I was interested in consumer protection law. She said, consumer protection law. What does that mean? I said, it means representing people who have been defrauded or deceived by businesses, financial institutions, predatory lenders, scammers, people who have been taken advantage of and don't have the resources or the knowledge to fight back. She said, so you're going to be a lawyer for poor people? I said, for people who have been wronged and need help. Yes, she said, Diana, law school costs a fortune. If you're going to spend 3 years and $100,000 on a law degree, you should at least be making money at the end of it. I said, consumer protection attorneys make money. She said, not like corporate lawyers. I said, I don't want to be a corporate lawyer. She said, I know you don't, that's what worries me. She said, you're 24 years old and you're choosing a career path that's going to pay you less than it could because you want to help people who got scammed. She said, Diana, you can help people without a law degree. You don't need to spend $100,000 to be a good person. I said, I'm not doing it to be a good person. I'm doing it because consumer protection law is where I want to practice and where I believe I can do the most meaningful work. She said, it's a mistake. She said it with the specific certainty of someone who has evaluated a situation and arrived at a conclusion they consider settled, not true. The statement of a woman who had spent 31 years making practical decisions and was watching her daughter make what she considered an impractical one. I said, it's my mistake to make. She said, yes, it is. I went to UNC Chapel Hill. I want to walk through the 12 years that followed because the details matter to the parking lot phone call. Law school was 3 years of the specific kind of intellectual engagement that I had been looking for since I understood what law was: the precise analysis of rights and remedies, the construction of arguments, the understanding of how institutions and systems could be used to protect people who did not understand those institutions and systems well enough to protect themselves. I graduated in the top 15% of my class. I clerked for a federal judge for a year. I joined the North Carolina Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division. My mother said, the Attorney General's office, so you're a government lawyer? I said, yes. She said, what does that pay? I told her. She said, Diana, you could make 3 times that in private practice. I said, I know, I don't want 3 times that. I want to do this work. She said, it's a mistake. The same sentence, 3 years after the first one. I spent 4 years at the Attorney General's office building a practice in consumer fraud enforcement, the specific work of investigating and prosecuting businesses and individuals who defraud consumers, with a particular focus on the increasingly sophisticated fraud schemes that targeted elderly and vulnerable populations. It was not glamorous work in the way that corporate law was glamorous. It was consequential in ways that were measurable and real. I left the AG's office at 31 to join a private practice that did the same work from the plaintiff's side, representing individual consumers and class action plaintiffs who had been defrauded, suing the companies and individuals responsible. The financial model was different: contingency fees, meaning I was paid from the recoveries rather than by the hour, which meant the income was variable, but which also meant that when we won something real for the people. My mother said, you left a government job with benefits to do something that pays you sometimes and not other times. I said, contingency practice is well compensated when it works. She said, when it works? I said, yes. She said, and when it doesn't? I said, I manage the risk. She said, Diana. I said, Mom. She said, you're 31 years old and you left a stable job to chase contingency fees in a practice area that could have been anything. I said, it's where the work is. She said, it's a mistake. 3rd time. Over the following 8 years, I built a consumer protection practice that was, by any external measure, successful. I won cases. I recovered money for people who had been defrauded in ways they did not fully understand. I litigated against predatory lenders, against investment fraudsters, against the specific category of telephone and online scammers who had become, in the years since the internet had made communication cheap and anonymous, an epidemic of financial crime targeting people who were trusting or frightened or simply unaware. I became, without quite planning to, one of the recognized experts in elder fraud in North Carolina. Elder fraud, the specific category of financial crime that targets older adults, who are disproportionately victimized because they are more likely to have accumulated savings, more likely to be isolated, more likely to respond to authority figures, and less likely to have the technical sophistication to recognize the specific manipulation techniques that sophisticated scammers deploy. I had represented dozens of victims of elder fraud. I knew exactly how. I did not know until a Tuesday afternoon in September that my mother had become one of its victims. She called at 2:47 in the afternoon. I was in a deposition. My phone was on silent, but I saw the name on the screen and I excused myself because my mother did not call during working hours, and the fact that she was calling during working hours told me something was wrong before I answered. She was crying. Not quietly, the specific gasping kind of crying that happens when someone is past the point of managing themselves and has simply lost the structure that management requires. She said, "Diana." I said, "Mom, what happened?" She said, "I did something terrible." I said, "Are you safe? Where are you?" She said, "I'm in my car, outside the Western Union on Park Road." I said, "Stay there, I'm coming." I drove to the Western Union on Park Road. She was in her car, a blue Camry she had driven for 7 years, parked in the far corner of the lot. She was still crying when I knocked on the window. I got in the passenger seat. I listened. The story she told me over the next 40 minutes was one I had heard variations of dozens of times in my professional life. The specific script of a government impersonator scam, which was one of the most prevalent and destructive elder fraud schemes in operation, and which worked with devastating consistency, precisely because it deployed the authority structures that people like my mother had been taught to respect their entire lives. It had started 3 weeks ago. The caller had identified himself as an agent with the Social Security Administration. He had told my mother that her Social Security number had been compromised, linked to criminal activity. He said, specifically a drug trafficking operation that had been using identities stolen from legitimate citizens. He said her accounts were at risk of being frozen pending investigation. He said she needed to take immediate action to protect her assets. My mother had done everything right by the framework she had been given. She had asked for his name, his badge number, his supervisor's name. He had provided all of these things fluently and without hesitation because he had provided them hundreds of times before, and the information was false, and the falseness did not matter because there was no way for her to verify it in the moment. He had told her that to protect her assets during the investigation, she needed to convert them to a secure form, specifically, to withdraw cash and wire it to a protected government account where it would be held safely until the investigation concluded and her name was cleared. He had walked her through the process. He had stayed on the phone with her. He had told her not to tell anyone because the investigation was active and telling someone could compromise it. Over 3 weeks in 3 separate transactions, my mother had wired $47,000, the money she had spent 31 years saving. I sat in the passenger seat of her blue Camry and listened to all of it. I did not say, "I knew this could happen." I did not say, "This is exactly what I've spent 12 years working on." I did not say anything for a moment. I said, "Mom, I need you to tell me exactly what happened from the beginning. Every detail. I'm going to help you." She looked at me. She said, "You're a lawyer." I said, "Yes." She said, "A consumer protection lawyer." I said, "Yes." She said, This is what you do." I said, "Yes. This is exactly what I do." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Diana, I told you it was a mistake." I said, "I know." She said, "For 12 years I told you it was a mistake." I said, "Yes." She said, "And now?" I said, "And now I need you to tell me everything. We don't have much time, but we have some. Let's use it." I want to describe what the next 72 hours looked like, because they are the demonstration of what 12 years of consumer protection law practice actually produces. The first call I made from the parking lot was to the North Carolina Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, the office where I had worked for 4 years and where I still had colleagues and relationships. I described the situation in the specific technical language of a government impersonator scam, and asked about any active investigations in the region that might be related. My former supervisor took my call immediately and promised to flag the case. The second call was to the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center. The FBI handles federal wire fraud cases, and a $47,000 wire fraud involving multiple transactions met the threshold. I had worked with FBI agents on previous cases, and I had a contact in the Charlotte field office who I reached directly. The third call was to the bank, my mother's bank, where the wire transfers had originated. I knew the relevant federal regulations under which banks are required to respond to fraud claims involving wire transfers, and I knew the specific window in which reversal or recovery is possible and what that window is. 2 of the 3 transferred. 1 was not. I spent 90 minutes on the phone with the bank's fraud department, then with their legal department, then with a senior vice president who had the authority to make the decision I was asking for. I cited the specific regulatory framework. I described the specific scam pattern. I referenced the FBI complaint number I had obtained. I was, in the specific way of someone who knows the system completely and is using every part of it, relentless. $15,200 recovered. The other $31,800 was gone into a wire transfer network that had been specifically designed to make recovery impossible. I knew this before I started. I pursued the recovery anyway because the $15,000 was real and because the effort of pursuing it was the job. My mother did not fully understand what I had done until I explained it to her the following evening at her kitchen table, with a cup of tea she had made and a legal pad where I had written out the timeline of what had happened and what the options were going forward. I explained the recovery. I explained why the rest was unlikely to be recovered. I explained the reports that had been filed and what would happen with them. The AG's office would add the case to their ongoing investigation of the scam network. The FBI would incorporate it into their broader case, and my mother's experience would contribute, along with dozens of others, to an eventual enforcement action that would not return her money but might prevent the same thing from happening to someone else. She listened to all of it. When I finished, she said, "You got $15,000 back." I said, "Yes." She said, "In 90 minutes of phone call." I said, "Approximately." She said, "How did you know who to call?" I said, "I've been doing this for 12 years. She said, "Government impersonator scams." I said, "Elder fraud. This is one of the most common patterns. I've handled dozens of them." She said, "Dozens?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Victims like me?" I said, "People who did exactly what you did. People who answered the phone, tried to do the right thing, followed instructions from someone they believed was an authority." The scam is designed to work on intelligent, conscientious people. It specifically targets people who take their obligations seriously. "You're not naive, Mom. You were targeted because you're exactly the kind of person this scam is built for." She said, "That's either reassuring or terrifying." I said, "Both. Knowing how it works makes it less likely to happen again." She said, "You're going to tell me how it works?" I said, "Yes." I spent the next hour explaining the specific mechanics of government impersonator fraud, the authority simulation, the urgency creation, the isolation tactic, the money movement techniques. I explained it the way I explain it to clients, which is to say completely and without softening, because understanding the mechanism is the protection. She listened with the focused attention of someone who is processing something difficult and is committed to processing it fully rather than looking away. When I finished, she said, "The isolation, not telling anyone." I said, "Yes, that's the key mechanism. If you had called me when the first call came in, I would have told you immediately it was fraud." She said, "He said it would compromise the investigation." I said, "He said that because telling someone breaks the isolation, and the isolation is what makes everything else work." She said, "If I had called you." I said, "Yes." She said, "3 weeks ago." I said, "Yes." She said, "Diana." I said, "Yes." She said, "I don't call you about things like this. I've never thought of you as the person I call when something goes wrong." I said, "I know." She said, "I call your brother. I call my sister. I don't call you." I said, "I know." I said, "You can answer that better than I can." She said, "Because I've spent 12 years telling you that what you do is a mistake, and calling you when something goes wrong would mean admitting that it isn't." I said, "Yes." She said, "And so I didn't call you for 3 weeks while this was happening. I didn't call the one person who could have prevented all of it." I said, "Yes." She said, "Because of what I said about law school." I said, "Because of what you've been saying for 12 years, yes." She was quiet for a long time. She looked at the legal pad on the table with the timeline and the numbers. She looked at her tea. She said, $31,800. I said, "Yes." She said, "Is gone." I said, "Yes." She said, "Because I didn't call you." I said, "Because you didn't call me in time, and because someone targeted you specifically, and because the scam works." "All 3 of those things are true," she said, "but the first one is the one I could have changed." I said, "Yes." She said, "Diana." I said, "Yes, Mom." She said, "I owe you an apology that I don't know how to give." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I mean that the apology that's needed isn't just for tonight. It's for 12 years, for law school and the AG's office and the contingency practice, and every time I said it was a mistake." She said, "It was never a mistake." I said, "I know." She said, "I know that you know. I'm saying it because I need to say it and because you deserve to hear it." She said, "You went to law school and you built a practice in the exact area that I needed tonight. And I waited 3 weeks to call you because I had spent 12 years telling you it was a mistake." She said, "And $31,000 is the price of that." I said, "Mom, the scam is the price of that. You didn't cause this." She said, "I didn't prevent it." I said, "No." She said, "Because I didn't call you." I said, "No." She said, "Because of what I said about law school." I said, "Because of the isolation mechanism and because you didn't know I could help." "Both things." She said, "I should have known you could help." I said, "Yes." She said, "I chose not to know." I said, "Yes." She said, "Because knowing would have required me to revise 12 years of it's a mistake." I said, "Yes." She said, $31,000. I said, "Yes." She said, "That's what the revision cost." I said, "Yes." We sat at her kitchen table for a long time after that. The tea went cold. The legal pad sat between us with its timeline and its numbers. Outside her kitchen window, the neighborhood was doing its ordinary evening things: a dog being walked, a car pulling into a driveway, the specific ambient sound of a life that continues regardless of what has happened inside a kitchen. She said, "Eventually, what do I need to do now, practically?" I said, "I'll send you a list tonight. New phone number: the scammers share contact information within their networks and you may receive follow-up calls. Credit monitoring. Updated banking passwords and security question. And I want you to call me when you get calls from numbers you don't recognize." She said, "Call you?" I said, "Call me. Not just for scam call, for anything that feels wrong." She said, "I don't usually call you." I said, "I know, I'm asking you to start." She said, because you're a I said, because I'm your daughter and also because I'm a consumer protection lawyer. She said, both. I said, both. She looked at me for a moment. She said, you came to a parking lot on Park Road in the middle of a deposition to sit in my car. I said, yes. She said, you spent 90 minutes on the phone getting $15,000 back. I said, yes. She said, you explained everything to me at my kitchen table so I understand it. I said, yes. She said, this is what you do. She said, for people like me. I said, for people who were targeted and need help. Yes, she said, for 12 years. I said, yes. She said, while I was saying it was a mistake. I said, yes. She said, Diana. I said, yes. She said, I'm proud of you. She said it the way people say things they have been withholding for a long time, not dramatically, not with the weight of a grand announcement, but with the specific simplicity of something that is true and has been true and is finally being said in the words rather than withheld. She said, I'm proud of what you built and what you know and what you did tonight. And I'm sorry it took me 12 years and $31,000 to say it. I said, I know. She said, is that enough? I said, it's what we have, and it's enough. She said, it should be more. I said, yes, but this is what we have. And I'm 39 years old and my mother is proud of me and I'm sitting at her kitchen table and the tea is cold and that is enough. She said, the tea is cold. I said, yes. She said, I'll make more. She made more tea. We sat at her kitchen table for another hour and talked not about the scam, not about the money, not about the 12 years. About her dental practice and the patients she had seen for decades. About my cases in the general terms I could share without violating privilege. About my brother and his family and what was happening with everyone. The ordinary conversation of mother and daughter who are finally in the same room in the way that matters. I drove home at 10 o'clock. I sent her the list before I went to sleep. The following morning she called me before 9. She said, I went through the list. I did everything. I said, good. She said, I have a question. I said, yes. She said, on the list you said to call you when I get calls from numbers I don't recognize. I said, yes. She said, does that mean you'll answer? I said, yes, Mom, I'll answer. She said, okay. She said, Diana. I said, yes. She said, I got a call this morning from a number I don't recognize. I said, what did they say? She said, nothing yet. I didn't answer. I called you first. I said, good. She sent me the number. I ran it through the databases I had access to through my practice, the fraud reporting networks, the scam tracker systems, the databases of numbers associated with known fraud operations. The number was associated with a known government impersonator scam network. A follow-up call exactly as I had predicted. I told her. She said, so they would have called again. I said, yes, they follow up. They tell victims there's been a development in the investigation that additional funds are needed, that the first transfer wasn't sufficient. She said, they would have asked for more money. I said, yes, that's the second phase of the scam, first transfer then follow up for additional amounts. She said, and I would have sent more. I said, probably. The victims of these scams often send multiple transfers because the relationship with the fraudster has been established and the authority simulation is maintained. She said, I would have sent more money. I said, yes, possibly. She said, because I didn't know what you know. I said, yes. She said, but you told me last night. I said, yes. She said, so now I know. I said, now you know. She said, and I called you first. I said, yes. She said, before I answered the number I said, yes. She said, that's different from 3 weeks ago. I said, yes. That's very different from 3 weeks ago. She said, because you told me to call you. I said, yes. She said, and I did. I said, yes. She said, Diana. I said, yes, Mom. She said, tell me what to do when they call back. I told her. She did what I told her. They did not get more money. I am 39 years old. I have a consumer protection practice that is exactly what I told my I represent people who have been wronged and need help. I know how the scams work. I know who to call and what to say and what the regulations require and how to use every part of the system to recover what can be recovered and document what cannot. My mother said it was a mistake for 12 years. She called me from a parking lot outside a Western Union. I drove to the parking lot. I got $15,000 back in 90 minutes. I explained everything at her kitchen table with cold tea and a legal pad. She called me the next morning before 9 before she answered a number she didn't recognize. That is the shape of the change, not a dramatic moment of revelation. A series of small things, the list, the morning call, the number sent to me before she answered it, that together represent something real. She calls me now, not just about suspicious phone numbers, about things that feel wrong. About decisions that involve money or authority or anyone who wants her to act quickly without telling anyone. She calls me, I answer, that is enough. That is finally everything. Some mothers say it's a mistake for 12 years. Some daughters build the practice anyway. And some Tuesday afternoons, the parking lot outside a Western Union is where 12 years of it's a mistake finally runs out of road. I was there. I am always there. That is the whole of what this story has. There is a part of this story I have not told yet, something that happened in the weeks after the parking lot that matters to the full picture. About 10 days after everything happened, my mother called me and asked if she could come to my office, not to discuss a case. She said, I want to see where you work. I said, of course. She drove to my office on a Thursday morning. I met her in the lobby. My office is not a dramatic space. It is a floor of a building in uptown Charlotte with the specific functional aesthetic of a litigation practice, conference rooms, a bullpen where the associates work, my office at the corner with its wall of case files and the whiteboard where I map out case theories. It is a working space, not a showroom. She walked through it slowly. She looked at the case files. She looked at the whiteboard. She looked at the photographs on my wall, the framed copies of verdicts and settlements that I had put up not as trophies but as reminders of what the work was for, each one representing a specific person who had gotten something back that had been taken from them. She stopped at one photograph. It was a photograph I had put up 3 years earlier, from a case that had been one of the most significant of my career. A class action against a predatory lending company that had systematically overcharged elderly borrowers through fees hidden in the fine print of reverse mortgage products. 212 clients, total recovery, $8.4 million. The photograph was from the day the settlement was announced. My clients, or the ones who had been able to come, were in a conference room, some of them elderly, some of them in wheelchairs, some of them with family members who had helped them navigate the process. They were not celebrating in the way that people celebrate a sporting victory. They were doing something quieter, the specific quality of relief that comes when something that was wrong has been made at least partially right. My mother looked at the photograph for a long time. She said, "Who are these people?" I said, "Clients from a class action I filed 3 years ago, predatory reverse mortgage case, 212 plaintiff." She said, "How old are they?" I said, "The plaintiffs ranged from 62 to 89. The average was 74. She said, "People my age." I said, "Some of them." She said, "And you got $8 million back for them." I said, 8.4. "Yes." She said, "You've been doing this specific thing." I said. She said, "Diana." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm 68 years old." I said, "Yes." She said, "The people in this photograph are my age." I said, "Yes." She said, "And what happened to me last month?" "That's what happened to them." I said, "Variations of it." "Yes." She said, "And you helped them?" I said, "Yes." She said, "The way you helped me?" I said, "Yes." She stood in front of the photograph for another minute without speaking. Then she said, "How many people like me have you helped?" Hundreds, not all as directly as last month. Some through class actions where I never met the individual clients. Some through policy work and regulatory advocacy that changes the systems that allow these schemes to operate. But the specific kind of person who was in my car in that parking lot, yes. Hundreds, she said, "And I told you it was a mistake." I said, "Yes." She said, "For 12 years I told you it was a mistake to spend your career helping people like me." She said, "While you were helping them?" I said, "Yes." She said, "While I wasn't calling you?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Diana?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I want to understand something." I said, "What?" She said, "When you were in school, when you told me consumer protection law was where you wanted to practice, did you already know this was who you would be helping?" I said, "I knew who was being harmed. People without resources, without knowledge of the system, without the ability to." Elderly people were one of the groups I knew was particularly vulnerable. She said, "Because they trust authority." I said, "Yes, and because they often have saving, and because they're isolated in ways that make the manipulation easier." She said, "You knew that at 24. I said, "I had done the research. I knew the statistics on elder fraud. I knew the gaps in consumer protection enforcement. I knew there was work to be done and I knew I wanted to do it." She said, and I said, "That you should make more money." I said, "You said it was a mistake." She said, 3 times. I said, "At least." She said, "Well, you knew all of that and we're going to do it anyway." I said, "Yes." She said, "I didn't make you doubt it." I said, "No." She said, "Why not?" I said, "Because I had done the research. I knew what the field was and what it needed and what I could contribute. Your assessment was based on a framework that didn't apply. I understood that even at 24. She said, "How did you understand it at 24? I said, "Because I had thought about it carefully and because I trusted what careful thinking told me more than I trusted a framework that didn't have the information to apply to my specific situation." She said, "You trusted your own judgment." I said, "Yes." She said, "Even though I said you were wrong?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I didn't undermine you." I said, "No, you frustrated me and then I went to law school." She smiled. She said, "I frustrated you." I said, "Yes." She said, "And then you went to law school?" I said, "Yes." She said, "And helped hundreds of people like me?" I said, "Yes." She said, "That's a good outcome for a frustrating conversation." I said, "Yes, it is." She looked at the photograph one more time. She said, "The woman in the wheelchair in the front row?" I said, "Yes." She said, "How much did she get back?" I said, "I can't tell you specifically. But everyone in that room received a portion of the recovery that was meaningful to them." She said, "Meaningful how?" I said, "One woman used her portion to pay off a debt she had been carrying since her husband died. Another one told me she was going to visit her grandchildren in another state for the first time in 3 years because she could afford the plane ticket." Meaningful varies by person, but for each of them it was real. She said, "They could afford things they couldn't afford." I said, "Yes, because the money was theirs and it had been taken from them and we got some of it back." She said, "That's what you do?" I said, "Yes." She said, "You get back what was taken?" I said, "When we can, not always. But when we can." She said, "Like last month?" I said, "Like last month." She said, 15,000. I said, 15,000. She said, "In 90 minutes?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Diana?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm going to tell people about you." She said, "My friends, the people at the dental practice, the women in my book club. I'm going to tell them that my daughter is a consumer protection lawyer and that if anything like what happened to me happens to them, they should call her." I said, "Mom," she said, "I should have been telling people about you for 12 years. I'm going to start now." I said, "You don't have to do that." She said, "I want to." I'm not doing it as a penance. I'm doing it because it's true and because it's useful and because the people in my life are exactly the kind of people who need to know someone like you exists." I said, "People my age?" She said, "Yes." I said, "With saving?" She said, "Yes." "Who trust authority figure?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Who might not call their lawyer daughters because they spent 12 years saying it was a mistake?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm going to fix that in my circle. Specifically." I said, "Okay." She said, "Is that useful?" I said, "Yes. Genuinely, awareness is one of the most effective preventions against these scams." She said, "Good, then I'll be useful." She has been useful. In the 3 months since the parking lot, she has sent 4 people to me. 4 people from her circles, 2 from her book club, 1 from the dental practice, 1 who is the mother of a colleague. All 4 called me. 3 of them had concerns that turned out to be legitimate fraud attempts at. 1 had a landlord dispute that was outside my practice area, but I referred her to a colleague who handled it. 4 people, in 3 months. Because my mother, who spent 12 years saying it was a mistake, started telling people her daughter was a consumer protection lawyer and if anything felt wrong they should call her. She came to my office again last month. Just to have lunch, not for any specific reason, not because something had happened. She called on a Wednesday and said she would be in Uptown and did I want to have lunch, and I said yes. We ate at a place around the corner from my office that I went to regularly. The staff knew me. The regular order was already started when we walked in. She noticed this. She said, "They know you here." I said, "I come here a lot." She said, "You're a regular." I said, "Yes." She said, "At a restaurant near your office." I said, "Yes." She said, "You have a life here." I said, "Yes, Mom." She said, "I didn't know that." I said, "You never came." She said, "No." She said, "I'm here now." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm going to come more." I said, "I'd like that." She said, "Diana." I said, "Yes." She said, "What you said in the car that afternoon, you said I'm coming, I'm going to help you, let's use the time we have." I said, "Yes." She said, "You didn't say anything about law school." I said, "No." She said, "You didn't say I told you so." I said, "No." She said, "Why not?" I said, "Because you were in a parking lot crying and you needed help, not a lecture." She said, "Even though I had it coming." I said, "Maybe, but that wasn't the moment." She said, "When would the moment have been?" I said, "This one now, when there's time and the crisis is over and you ask the question yourself." She said, "I asked." I said, "You asked." She said, "And you answered." I said, "I answered." She said, 12 years. I said, "Yes." She said, "And $31,000. I said, "Yes." She said, "And then you drove to a parking lot on Park Road." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you didn't say anything about law school." I said, "No." She said, "That's very disciplined of you." I said, "I've been practicing." She laughed. I laughed. We finished lunch. She paid, what she had not done in years, not because she was making a statement but because she wanted to, she said, and I let her. She walked back to her car. She called me that evening. She said, "I had a good time today." She said, "I'm going to come more." I said, "I know." She said, "To lunch and to see the office and just to be there." I said, "Yes." She said, "Diana." I said, "Yes." She said, "I love you." I should say that more than I do. I said, "I know you do." She said, "I'm going to say it more." I said, "Okay." She said, "I love you." I said, "I love you too, Mom." She said, "Good." She said, "Call me if anything comes up with the case follow-up." I said, "I will." She said, "And I'll call you." "You will?" She said, "I already know the number." I said, "Yes, you do. I am 39 years old. I have a consumer protection practice that is exactly what I told my mother it would be when I was 24. I represent people who have been wronged. I get back what can be gotten back. I explain what cannot. My mother said it was a mistake for 12 years. She called me from a parking lot on Park Road. I drove to the parking lot. She comes to my office for lunch now. She tells her friends about me. She calls me when things feel wrong. She says I love you more than she used to. That is the complete story, not just the parking lot, not just the $15,000. The lunch, the regular order, the staff who knew me, the photograph on my wall, the 4 people she sent me in 3 months, the morning call before she answered the number she didn't recognize. All of it, that is enough, that is everything. Some mothers say it's a mistake. And some daughters drive to the parking lot anyway. And some lunches around the corner become the beginning of something that the parking lot made possible, but that is finally its own thing. Separate from the mistake, separate from the 12 years, just a mother and a daughter having lunch. Near the office the mother said was a mistake. That is enough. That has always been enough. That is everything.